All right, so today we're diving into Israeli politics. Yeah, you heard that right. We're tackling a Wikipedia article about it, and believe me, it's a lot juicier than it sounds. We're not just talking dry facts here. This is about power struggles, unexpected alliances, basically a nation figuring out its place in the world.
And a lot of that comes down to Zionism, which, is the movement for a Jewish state in Israel. But here's the thing. It's not as simple as it seems. It's not some unified front. You know what I mean? It's more like, think about a family, but they've got some, shall we say, strong opinions about how things should be run.
Okay, so like family drama, got it. But walk me through it. What are these different branches of Zionism and what do they actually believe? Like, how do these differences play out when it comes to elections and all that?
So picture this. You've got labor Zionism. These are the idealists, right? They were all about like building a socialist utopia, strong unions, making peace with the neighbors, the whole kibbutz life, everybody working together. Then you've got revisionist Zionism. They were a bit more hawkish. Strong military was their thing, less about compromise, and way more into a capitalist system.
Okay, so two very different visions right off the bat. What about the third group?
Right, so that's religious Zionism. For them, it's all about divine promise. Israel exists because it was meant to be. And their political views, totally rooted in religious law. They've got a lot of influence, especially when it comes to settlement and religion's role in everyday life. Now, imagine all three of these groups trying to share power.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for some lively debate, to say the least.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Golda Meir, Israel's first female prime minister, she once said that Israel has 3 million prime ministers, one for every citizen.
Yeah.
But jokes aside, this is why Israeli politics are anything but boring. I mean, look at the early years. Mapai and the alignment, they were like the poster children for labor Zionism.
Yeah.
They were running the show for almost 30 years after Israel was founded. Then, boom.
1977, that was a huge turning point, right? Menachem Begin and Likud came in like a wrecking ball.
Yeah, and Begin's win. That wasn't just a change in party. It was a total shift in how Israel saw itself in the world.
Yeah.
Less compromise, more military strength. It was a sign of things to come. And then, to make things even more interesting, in 1996, they started having direct elections for prime minister.
Which is how we got Netanyahu. I mean, everyone knows who he is at this point. And then there was Ariel Sharon. He was like this hardliner who went and formed his own centrist party, Kadima, right? Talk about a plot twist.
Oh, Sharon's move threw everyone for a loop. He basically said, hey, this whole left versus right thing, it's not working. And this is where it gets really interesting because the political center in Israel, it's not just some middle ground. It's got its own way of looking at things, especially when it comes to stuff like the Palestinian conflict.
So it's less about ideology and more about like finding a way to move forward, even if it's messy. Give me an example. How does that work in the real world?
Okay, so think about Israeli settlements in the West Bank, right? The right wing, they're all about expansion. It's a right based on history and religion. The left, they say it's against international law, a roadblock to peace. The center, they might be okay with some existing settlements, but they're also pushing for a two-state solution, some kind of negotiation. It's a lot of pragmatism, focusing on security and realistic solutions. Ideology isn't everything.
Okay, that makes sense. But it can't just be the big players calling all the shots, right? I mean, we always hear about these smaller parties in Israeli politics. What's their deal?
Ah, yes, the wild card. See, when you've got a parliamentary system with all these coalitions, these smaller parties, they basically become kingmakers. Seriously, they have way more power than their size suggests because they can say, hey, you want our votes? You got to give us what we want.
High stakes. It's like they're playing 4D chess while everyone else is still figuring out checkers. Got any examples of these power players?
Oh, tons. Like Gush Emunim. They're small, but they've had a huge influence, especially on the whole settlement issue. They're not a big party themselves, but their whole thing about settling the West Bank, yeah, that's had a huge impact on the conversation. Then you've got groups like Peace Now. They're super critical of some of Israel's military actions. Their voice matters, even if they're not the majority. Adds another layer,
And then there's the Histadrut, which is the main labor union, right? Ugh. That feels like its own thing.
Yeah, the Histadrut is interesting because they're not just your typical left-leaning union. I mean, they care about workers' rights for sure, but they also think about national security and the economy. It shows you how even these labels like labor or left, they don't always tell the whole story.
So we've got the different flavors of Zionism, this center that plays by its own rules and all these smaller parties shaking things up. What else factors into this whole Israeli political web?
Oh, we can't forget about the rabbis. I mean,
Yeah.
They have a lot of influence, especially on these ultra-Orthodox parties like Shas and United Torah Judaism. Their views on religious law and state funding for religious stuff, Yeah, that carries a lot of weight, especially when you're trying to build a coalition. It shows you how religion plays a much bigger role in Israeli politics than in a lot of other democracies.
It's kind of wild how much religion factors into the political scene in Israel. I mean, you don't really see that in most other democracies. And speaking of unique dynamics, our research mentioned this group, the Monitor Committee of Israeli Arabs. They're like a voice for the Arab minority in Israel, right? And they seem to be pushing for more separation, their own thing.
Yeah, the Monitor Committee itself is interesting, right? Because it shows that even within Israel's democracy, there are groups who are still fighting for their place at the table. It reminds you that this country is made up of all these different identities and interests. And speaking of complex, we kind of have to talk about the big stuff, the issues that are always there in Israeli politics, almost like, the elephant in the room or
Yeah.
a camel in the tent, maybe.
You mean like the big three, right? The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, religion's role in the state, and the economic challenges. Those are unavoidable topics if we're talking about Israel.
Exactly. So let's start with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because this isn't just some abstract geopolitical thing. It's woven into the fabric of Israeli society. It affects everyday life, political discourse, everything.
It's almost heartbreaking when you think about how differently this conflict is viewed, even within Israel itself.
It's this huge knot of history, security concerns, religious claims, national identity. You've got people on the right who are all about expanding Israeli settlements in the West Bank. They see it as a historical right, a biblical right even. And then on the left, you've got people who see those same settlements as the biggest obstacle to peace, a violation of international law. And then, of course, you have this whole spectrum of opinions in between.
We came across some groups in our research, like the Geneva Initiative and the People's Voice. Seems like they're trying to find some common ground, some way forward.
And those groups are important because they show that there is a desire for peace, or at least a peaceful resolution, on both sides. They tend to support a two-state solution, an independent Palestine alongside Israel. But even that idea is really complicated. It comes with a whole other set of challenges.
And it's not just about drawing lines on a map, right? It's also about religion, which is that second big issue you mentioned. It feels like those two things are inseparable.
Oh, absolutely. The line between religion and politics in Israel, super blurry. Like, think about Jerusalem, right? A holy city for both Jews and Muslims. And the whole debate over who controls those sacred sites. Textbook example of how religion and politics collide.
And it goes beyond the big picture stuff, even everyday things like marriage, divorce, even how you bury people. It can all be tied to religious authorities, which has got to create some tension in a country with so many different religious and secular identities.
For sure. And that tension is a huge deal when it comes to political parties, what they believe, who they work with.
Yeah.
It explains why these small religious parties, even if they don't get a ton of votes overall, they can have a lot of power. They're essential for building coalitions, so they can basically say, if you want our support, you got to support our religious beliefs.
So it's like they hold all the cards. But let's switch gears for a sec and talk about the economy, because even if people have strong beliefs about politics or religion, they still got to make a living, right?
Absolutely. And Israel's actually done a pretty impressive job. I mean, they've got this strong, tech-driven economy. But like any economy, it's not perfect. There are definitely disparities and frustrations.
So, like, what are the big economic issues that come up in Israeli politics? What are people worried about?
The cost of living is a big one.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really expensive to live in Israel, which is frustrating for a lot of people, especially young people, and those who aren't benefiting from the whole tech boom.
So it's an affordability crisis. What else?
Housing is another huge issue. Trying to find affordable housing, especially in places like Tel Aviv, is incredibly difficult. And this isn't just an economic problem, right? It affects everything. Society, politics, who people vote for. It's a big deal.
It's wild how even in a country as small as Israel, you have these completely different economic realities playing out. You've got the success of the tech sector, and then you have people who are struggling to keep up.
It's that classic haves and have-nots story. And it kind of mirrors the political divides in Israel. You've got those who believe in a free market, individual responsibility, and then you've got those who think the government needs to step in and provide more of a safety net.
So it's almost like two different worlds, two different Israels, all happening at the same time. And it's not just the economy that exists on different levels like that. We've talked about the internal divisions, those big three issues, but then there's also how Israel is viewed on the world stage. It's like we're zoomed in on all the inner workings of Israeli politics, but we can't forget about the bigger picture, right?
Yeah.
How does Israel deal with everything going on internationally, especially in such a tense region?
It's a real balancing act for sure. You've got the relationship with the United States, which is obviously huge for Israel. The U.S. is their main ally. providing tons of support, both financially and militarily. That alone shapes a lot of Israel's decisions on the world stage.
Yeah, it seems like you can't really talk about Israel's place in the world without talking about the U.S. But it's not always smooth sailing between them, is it? I mean, haven't there been disagreements, especially when it comes to the Palestinians?
Oh, for sure. They don't always agree. Different presidents have different priorities, different approaches, and that can make things a bit unpredictable for Israel. It's a good reminder that even when you're close allies, you're not going to agree on everything.
Exactly. Like in any close friendship, you might agree on the big stuff, but then there's that one friend who never does the dishes. But on a more serious note, what other relationships are important for understanding Israel's place in the world?
Well, one interesting thing lately has been Israel getting closer with some of its Arab neighbors. For a long time, Israel was basically surrounded by hostility. But now, because of shared concerns like Iran and these extremist groups, there have been some surprising opportunities for dialogue and even cooperation.
Right, like the Abraham Accords, that was a big deal. Israel normalizing relations with the UAE and Bahrain, it felt like a major turning point.
Totally. It shows you how things can change, how new alliances form when there are common interests, even in a place with so much history of conflict.
Definitely shows that you can never predict what's going to happen in international relations. But even with these positive steps, Israel still faces some serious security threats. That's got to weigh heavily on their political decisions.
Without a doubt. Security is paramount in Israel. It influences everything. How much they spend on defense, their foreign policy, you name it, and the Iranian nuclear program. Yeah, that casts a big shadow over everything.
It's a constant worry, right? The idea of a nuclear-armed Iran is terrifying for a lot of Israelis.
Exactly. And that fear plays out in their politics. There are always debates about how to deal with Iran, military action, diplomacy, or some combination. It's a high-stakes situation with no easy answers.
It's easy to forget about all that when we're focused on the internal stuff, but it's always there in the background. But even with these threats, our research mentioned something kind of surprising. It said that Freedom House ranks Israel as the only free country in the Middle East.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting one, considering the history of that region and all the authoritarianism that still exists. But it also makes you think about what we even mean by free in this context. I mean, how do you square that ranking with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the occupation of the West Bank, the tensions between different religious and secular groups within Israel?
It's a tough question, and it shows that there are so many different sides to every story. It's been amazing to go this deep to see how complex and fascinating it all really is.
And that's the whole point, right? It's not about finding easy answers. It's about asking the tough questions, challenging our assumptions, and getting comfortable with nuance.
Exactly. Even a Wikipedia article can open up a whole world of new perspectives and challenges.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So keep those questions coming, keep exploring different viewpoints, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.
Thanks for listening, everyone.